Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Sam McGill. I'm a facilitator with Sacramento State University's Consensus and Collaboration Program. I'm assisting the Santa Rosa Plain Groundwater Sustainability Agency with facilitating this community workshop. It is 5:30 right now. I know we're expecting a few more participants, but I want to just run through a couple of quick meeting protocols before we have an introductory video from Linda Hopkins, the chair of the Santa Rosa Plain Groundwater Sustainability Agency. You'll notice that all of your lines are muted. We're going to go ahead and keep those muted throughout the discussion until we get to some designated question and answer periods. And that's just to help kind of cut down on any background noise. If you could go ahead and disable your video as well, that would be wonderful, just so that we can kind of keep any background distractions to a minimum. There will be plenty of time for Q&A once we get to a series of breakout sessions later in the agenda. But to start with, we want to run through just a couple of quick presentations to help give you an overview of the Santa Rosa Plain Basin itself, and then talk a little bit about what groundwater sustainability looks like. Before we jump into it and go to Linda Hopkins' introductory video, I do want to go ahead and offer Andy Rogers, the administrator of the Santa Rosa Plain GSA, the opportunity to provide any welcoming remarks. Andy, you want to go ahead and welcome the group?
Hi, good afternoon. I'm hoping you can hear me. My name is Andy Rogers. As Sam said, I'm the administrator for the Santa Rosa Plain Groundwater Sustainability Agency. It's quite an honor to be doing this, and it's great and very exciting to be bringing this information to the community, representing an awful lot of work from an awful lot of people, advisory committees, our board, and we're really looking forward to getting the input from today. So thank you for taking the time to be on yet another Zoom meeting. Back to you, Sam.
Thanks, Andy. Yeah, I just want to reiterate Andy's thanks for all of you joining us. I know that everybody at this point in our various quarantine situations have probably been on a million of these Zoom calls. It's our goal to provide you with some key information on what some of the groundwater management actions in the Santa Rosa Plain Basin look like, and give you the opportunity to provide some input to staff as well as they continue the development of the groundwater sustainability plan. I know I'm throwing a lot of terminology at you right now, but all of that's going to make sense pretty shortly when I turn it over to Marcus Trotta from Sonoma Water. He'll provide kind of an introductory presentation. Before we get to that, though, I do want to go ahead and play a short video from Linda Hopkins, the chair of the Santa Rosa Plain GSA, who will welcome you and provide some context for today's meeting. So I'll go ahead and start the video, and then we will jump into the presentation and do a quick review of the agenda.
Hello everyone, I'm Linda Hopkins, chair of the Santa Rosa Plain Groundwater Sustainability Agency. Welcome to tonight's workshop. The bad news about meeting virtually is that we don't have the chance to see old friends and make new acquaintances. But the good news is that instead of eating stale cookies in a dark meeting room, we can relax in our kitchens or gardens and enjoy a home-cooked meal while we sip on a Sonoma County beverage. So please make yourself comfortable and prepare to enjoy the upcoming presentations. Before we start the formal part of the agenda, I want to acknowledge the importance of groundwater to our communities. In Santa Rosa Plain, an estimated 32,000 people rely on groundwater for drinking, cooking, and other necessities of life. Groundwater in this basin irrigates 11,000 acres of crops, and it supplies critical water to plants and animals, some of which are unique to local ecosystems and others of which are endangered or threatened. Statewide, 40% of the water used is from groundwater, which is why the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act became law in 2015. SGMA, as it's known, resulted in California joining all the other western states which manage groundwater. In Sonoma County, 3 local basins are subject to SGMA. Those are Petaluma Valley, Santa Rosa Plain, and Sonoma Valley. All 3 basins created groundwater sustainability agencies to comply with SGMA, and these agencies have boards made up of local elected officials and include advisory committees with representatives from a wide variety of stakeholders. I am the County of Sonoma's representative on the Santa Rosa Plain Groundwater Sustainability Agency, and I also serve as chair of the GSA Board of Directors. SGMA requires that the GSA develop a plan that assesses current and future groundwater conditions in our basin, and then to specifically address how we will fix or prevent any problems that are identified. We're more than halfway through the planning process, and the purpose of tonight's meeting is to first tell you what our staff have found in terms of current and future groundwater conditions. Second, we're going to provide some background about how SGMA requires our local community to measure whether the basin is sustainable. Third, we will break out into virtual working groups to discuss your priorities regarding sustainability. Again, get comfortable, but also roll up your sleeves. We really need your input and feedback.
We will begin momentarily.
All right. I know Linda wishes that she could be here in person today, but thank you for that opening message. Hopefully that gave you at least some basic context on why we're all here today. As was mentioned in that opening video, we're going to go through a couple of presentations that will help give you some background on what groundwater sustainability looks like in the Santa Rosa Plain basin, and as well as just an overview of the basin setting itself. So with that, I want to go ahead and sit back and turn it over to Marcus Trotta from Sonoma Water to provide an opening presentation on basin setting. Marcus, go ahead and start it up whenever you're ready.
Okay, great. Thank you, Sam. Hopefully everybody can hear me okay. My name is Marcus Trotta. As Sam mentioned, I work for Sonoma Water. I'm a principal hydrogeologist there. And we're also serving as a staff to the GSA, to the Groundwater Sustainability Agency. And my specific role is I'm managing the development of the Groundwater Sustainability Plan that we're going to give you an overview of today. And I just want to also acknowledge that as Andy Rogers had mentioned, this is very much a team effort in terms of the Groundwater Sustainability Agency Board, Advisory Committee, and then we have a team of hydrogeologists, engineers, public information specialists, biologists at Sonoma Water, as well as consultants that are also supporting work on this plan. So it's very much a team effort. And so with that, I'll kind of dive right in. If you live in areas stretching from Cotati up to Windsor and from Sebastopol east to Santa Rosa, you likely live in the Santa Rosa Plain groundwater basin. And the purpose of my presentation today is to briefly describe this new law that Director Hopkins mentioned, which requires Californians to locally manage their groundwater resources, and then orient you to the plan that is required by that law, which we are in the process of developing, known as a Groundwater Sustainability Plan, or GSP. I'll be focusing on the initial phases of that plan, which we have been developing, which describes the features of the basin we live in, including its geology and groundwater conditions. This information provides a foundation for understanding how to best manage our local groundwater and what types of projects or actions might be needed to ensure this valuable resource remains sustainable into the future. So the Santa Rosa Plain Basin is defined by the state of California's Department of Water Resources. And it's based primarily on geologic and other characteristics like rivers and cities. And the Santa Rosa Plain groundwater subbasin, as it's known, is shown on this map as outlined in the dashed blue line here. And that's the area which the Groundwater Sustainability Agency has jurisdiction. Within the plan, we're also including analyses of the larger watershed area that contributes to that main groundwater subbasin, which is shown as outlined in the darker gray shading, because those areas represent important sources of inflow to the groundwater subbasin, the Santa Rosa Plain subbasin, which the Groundwater Sustainability Agency must manage. The basin itself primarily includes the valley floor and then is bordered by the coastal mountains on the west and the Yakima and Sonoma Mountains to the east. In Sonoma County, there are actually 14 designated groundwater basins and subbasins by the state. Of those, only 3 must currently comply with the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, or SGMA, which became law in 2015, primarily because they're more developed and have larger amounts of groundwater dependency. Those three basins are complying with SGMA by having created groundwater sustainability agencies, which are governed by boards of directors comprised primarily of elected officials. These GSA boards receive input from diverse stakeholder-based advisory committees. The three basins are now working on the second step of compliance, which is to develop groundwater sustainability plans, which are due January of 2022. And those plans must lay out steps to either maintain or achieve sustainable conditions that are locally defined within the basin within 20 years of adoption of the plan. The plans explain the basin conditions, identifying any problems or potential problems with groundwater, and will outline projects and actions that may be needed or taken to correct any problems in the basins. The Sonoma County GSAs are independent agencies, but coordinate with each other as well as with local cities and the county to leverage resources and promote efficiency. The goal of SGMA and the plans are to ensure that groundwater is available today and into the future for all users, including rural residents, farmers, businesses, and the environment. To date, draft sections 1 and 2 of the plan are primarily complete, and most of section 3 is complete. In 2020, staff has been working to finish sections 3 and 4 of the plan, with the goal of having the full final draft of the plan available for public review in fall of 2021 before it needs to get submitted to the state of California. This presentation is going to highlight information that is provided in detail in the draft first 3 sections of the GSP. These sections describe the basin and groundwater conditions. And so this presentation will cover only the key findings of those portions of the plan. If you're interested in reviewing all of the details and getting a better view of many of the figures that we'll be showing today, you can go to that web link that's down in the left-hand corner, santarosaplaingroundwater.org, to read those full draft sections and see all of the figures that we have included. So the Santa Rosa Plain subbasin is approximately 80,000 acres in size. And it's about 22 miles long, and the width of it varies from about 6 to 9 miles east to west. In this figure, the basin is defined by those blue dashed lines, and you can see that it shares boundaries with several other groundwater basins and subbasins, including the Petaluma Valley Basin to the south, the Wilson Grove Basin to the west, as well as the Healdsburg area and Russian River basins to the northwest, and is connected also to the Rincon Valley Basin to the east. Cities within the basin include the town of Windsor, cities of Santa Rosa, Roanoke Park, Cotati, and Sebastopol. And the basin also includes many parks and open space lands. Again, looking at areas within the Blue Basin boundary, much of the land is used for residential purposes, as shown in brown on this land use map that was done back in 2012. Other major land use features include irrigated agriculture, that's shown in the gold coloring on this map. Much of the agricultural land is planted in vines, defined by the pink areas, with the largest areas of those being in the northern and northern eastern portions of the basin. Other agricultural lands include pastures shown in peach, annual crops shown in bright green, and hayfields shown in the bright yellow coloring. Major creeks in the basin include Mark-West Creek, Santa Rosa Creek, and the Laguna de Santa Rosa, which drain a combined watershed area of approximately 251 square miles. These waterways are an important source of water for some people and farmers, and are also critical sources for fish and other species that inhabit the groundwater basin. All of the municipal water suppliers in the basin use groundwater to varying degrees. but most cities, shown in yellow, rely primarily on surface water imported into the basin from the Russian River system. Um, Although most of those cities also rely on groundwater as a backup supply, Sebastopol is actually the only city in the basin which is completely reliant on groundwater resources. In some areas, recycled water, which is shown in purple, is treated to tertiary standards by wastewater treatment plants and is used for crop irrigation and landscape irrigation instead of groundwater or imported water, which makes it represent a very important alternative source of water that can offset the use of groundwater and other potable water sources. The brown, reddish brown, and gold areas outside of the city limits illustrate locations where residents and farmers rely primarily on groundwater as a resource. So this pie chart also illustrates the importance of groundwater and how it fits in with two of those other main sources of supplies in the basin, indicating that groundwater represents about 35% of the total water needs within the basin itself. These percentages are approximate and can vary quite a bit annually based on conditions. For example, during droughts, groundwater use often increases and Russian River water use commonly will decline. So with so many people and farmers and the environment relying on groundwater, it's important to understand the health of our groundwater system. Because we can't physically see what's happening underground, we use monitoring wells as our eyes. By checking water levels in these wells over time, a picture begins to emerge of our basin. This map shows in orange or peachy colored dots the monitoring wells that are available that measure conditions in the shallow aquifer system, and I'll give a description of that a few slides later. So what is the groundwater picture in the Santa Rosa Plain Basin? Section 3 of the plan that I alluded to provides an in-depth look to that. This presentation is going to focus on the following two components of that section, which are the hydrogeologic conceptual model and current and historical groundwater conditions. The hydrogeologic conceptual model simply characterizes the physical processes that control the distribution, occurrence, and movement of the surface water and groundwater systems in the basin, including regional weather, hydrology, geology, water quality, and its principal aquifers. Much of the information that we have incorporated into the plan, and I'll be providing here today, comes from a fairly recent study of the Santa Rosa Plain Basin by scientists with the U.S. Geological Survey, which completed a study back in 2014, which included a computer model of the basin that has been a very important data source for us in terms of developing our local plan. So it's important to understand that all water that enters the aquifer system got its start at one point or another as rainfall falling over the basin or in that contributing watershed area. We live in a Mediterranean climate with about 93% of our rainfall occurring between October and May, and much of that rainfall coming in 3 or 4 major storms. Many of those are known as atmospheric rivers. While the average annual rainfall in the basin itself ranges from about 27 to 42 inches annually, as shown in the green and yellow shades in the basin, the larger watershed outside those bright lines has higher average rainfall and provides important contributions to our groundwater basin. The type of soil in an area can define how quickly water infiltrates from the surface into the aquifer. Gravelly and sandy soils like those shown in yellow on this map, found in the low hills in the southwestern and western areas of the basin, that area of the Wilson Grove, allow for more infiltration than the clayey soils found throughout much of the basin, such as those shown in the red. This next map shows the hydraulic conductivity of the soils in the basin, which provides an indication as to the rate at which water moves through those soils. And most of the basin, which is shown in the orangish colors, has a relatively low hydraulic conductivity between 0.1 and 4 feet per day, while those areas near Lower Marquess Creek, Santa Rosa Creek, and Windsor Creek, and in bright green near those stream beds where you find sandier soils and gravelly soils, often have a much higher conductivity, up to 4 to 12 feet per day, and as high as 12 to 40 feet within the stream beds themselves. The Santa Rosa, another key feature of the basin is faults, shown on this next map. The Santa Rosa Plain is located in a region of geologic complexity caused by long periods of active tectonic deformation, volcanic activity, and sea level changes. The brown lines on this map show the multiple faults in our basin, including the San Andreas system to the west, Rogers Creek, Myakama, and Bennett Valley fault zones to the east, and the Sebastopol Fault, which borders the western portions of the basin. Faults can influence the availability and quality of our groundwater by serving as boundaries for sedimentary basins and by creating barriers or conduits to water flow. While an oversimplification, we can think of the Santa Rosa Plain Basin when we look at it three-dimensionally, like a giant layer cake that's been shaken and stirred up a bit by all that faulting. This figure shows two slices of that cake, with the top slice cut from the northern section and the bottom slice cut from the southern section, going west to east. The Myakama and Sonoma Mountains are on the right, and the western part of Valley is on the left. Both of these slices show the oldest rocks, known as the Franciscan Formation, which form the basement in the basin, as olive green. These are older than 66 million years old, and essentially serve as the impermeable bottom layer, which holds all of the other groundwater bearing layers. The next deepest layer is either sedimentary rocks or volcanics, or a combination of both. The Sonoma volcanics, which are shown in orange here, are approximately 8 to 2.5 million years old, and the amount of groundwater varies greatly in this formation, and it can often be found in fractures of those volcanic rocks. The blue layer is known as the Petaluma Formation, is approximately 5 million years old, and is characterized by having lots of silts and clays. And the Wilson Grove Formation, which is the lighter brown color on the western edges of the basin, is slightly younger than the Petaluma Formation and is characterized by sandstone. It has a moderate to high permeability, resulting in large contributions of groundwater to wells that tap into that. And the transition between that Petaluma Formation in blue and that Wilson Grove Formation in tan is actually the location of an ancient shoreline during the time when those sediments were deposited, and kind of that interfingering of those two basins is due to changes in sea level during the time that those formations formed. The very thin yellow frosting layer at the top of the basin, which is very hard to see, it includes the Glen Ellen Formation, which is characterized by clay-rich stream deposits that can range from a few feet to a few hundred feet in depth and width, and quaternary alluvial deposits, which are also part of that frosting, and cover much of the flat eastern and southern valley floor. These deposits are generally younger than 100,000 years and are usually found along streams and alluvial fans in the basin. The distribution, extent, and interfingering of these 5 primary aquifer units reflect the complex geologic history of the basin. However, for the purposes of SGMA and the Groundwater Sustainability Plan, the aquifer system within the Santa Rosa Plain Basin has been broken up into a shallow and deeper aquifer systems. These definitions were chosen to reflect the degree of surface water connectivity, with that connectivity much greater in the shallow aquifer. The degree of confinement, the deeper aquifer is often confined in many areas by clay layers, as well as responses to hydraulic stresses like recharge and pumping, with the shallow aquifer being much more responsive to recharge and the deeper aquifer more responsive to pumping stresses. The shallow aquifer system generally extends from the water table to depths ranging from about 150 to 200 feet below the ground surface. The shallow aquifer system is present over the entire subbasin, and within it, groundwater levels we have found to be relatively stable over time within that shallow aquifer. In many areas, the shallow aquifer is locally and seasonally connected to streams and surface water bodies in the basin. And water in the shallow aquifer has generally been recharged within the last 50 years or so. The shallow aquifer supplies water to wells that support rural residents, some agriculture, as well as some of the shallower public water supply wells. The shallow aquifer provides water to streams and helps support plant life in some areas as well. The deep aquifer is generally present beneath approximately 200 feet below ground surface, and in most areas is separated from that shallow aquifer by layers of clay known as aquitards. The thickness of individual permeable aquifer zones within the deep aquifer system can be highly variable depending on the geologic formation which is present, and can range from several feet to hundreds of feet in thickness. Well productivity varies greatly in the deep aquifer as well, depending on those geologic characteristics. In some areas, water in the deep aquifer can be anywhere from 4,000 years old or to as much as 4,000 years old. The deep aquifer supplies water to water systems that supply rural residents, agriculture, businesses, and municipal water suppliers. So most of the water that gets into the aquifer infiltrates as rain that percolates on the ground surface into the basin, as well as percolation through stream beds is also another major source of recharge into the basin. Other sources can include leaking pipes, over irrigation, and septic tanks in some areas. Most of this recharge goes into the shallow aquifer. The deep aquifer is recharged through a combination of leakage from the shallow aquifer and mountain front recharge near margins of the valley. And this map shows an estimate of kind of relative recharge based on soil types, slopes, and other characteristics. Where groundwater resurfaces in the basin, this is known as groundwater discharge, and this occurs through creek beds, streams, seeps, interconnected wetlands, springs in some areas along the boundaries of the basin. Deep-rooted plants can also tap into shallow groundwater and evapotranspire that water. And wells represent discharge areas in the basin as well, where groundwater is brought up by pumps in those wells. Groundwater can also be exchanged underground with neighboring basins where they are connected. For example, groundwater generally flows into the basin from its western boundary with the Wilson Grove and its eastern boundary with the Sonoma Volcanics, and out of the basin along its northwestern boundary with the Russian River. Now that we have a basic understanding of geology, soils, faults, and other characteristics of the basin, we're going to address the question of what is happening to groundwater levels. Are they increasing, decreasing, staying about the same? Those monitoring wells we discussed earlier provide information about both short-term and long-term trends in groundwater levels. However, because of the geologic complexity of our basin and the variability of the monitoring wells themselves, the trends shouldn't necessarily be used to interpret what's happening directly in your neighborhood. Nearly all plots of groundwater level changes over time, known as hydrographs, indicate the groundwater levels within the basin have recently been relatively stable or actually increasing in some areas. Historically, there have been areas, if you could go back to that historically, there have been areas in the basin that have shown declines, primarily in the southern portions of the basin. This series of maps represent groundwater level contours, indicating the elevation of groundwater within wells throughout the basin, which with the blue areas showing higher groundwater levels and the warmer and redder colors showing lower groundwater levels. These maps indicate conditions from the 50s, kind of snapshots in the 50s, 1990 and 2007. And what they illustrate is that groundwater generally flows from the east to the west towards the Laguna de Santa Rosa. In the 80s and 90s through early 2000, there was groundwater level declines that occurred in the southern portions of the basin as groundwater was the primary source of municipal water supplies in the cities of Roanoke Park and Cotati. Beginning in about the mid 2000s, the cities made a transition and started relying a little more on imported water from the Russian River, as well as bringing in recycled water supplies, and have decreased that groundwater use. And you can see the change between 1990 and 2007, where those dark red areas have disappeared as groundwater levels have since recovered and are continuing to recover based on our more recent data. So now moving on to just looking at shallow wells. These maps show trends in wells over time, which have at least, I think, 5 to 10 years of data behind them. And analysis of these trends find that levels are stable in about 44 of 64 shallow wells, with 11 of the 64 wells exhibiting some declining trends, and 9 of the wells showing groundwater level increases over time. For the deep aquifer system, of the 25 wells analyzed, 8 indicated declines, 8 indicated increases, and 9 showed stable groundwater levels over time. So water levels are also measured continuously in several municipal wells and monitoring wells owned by cities and Sonoma Water. Most wells show seasonal fluctuations with water levels higher in the spring and lower in the fall, often with differences between 20 and 30 feet in the shallow aquifer. Wells in the deeper aquifer also show seasonal variations, but generally the difference between seasons in deep wells ranges from 5 to 10 feet. One thing that's important to note is that we do not have monitoring wells throughout the entire basin. There are areas of data gaps which are being assessed as part of this plan. And there will be plans for construction of future monitoring wells that'll be needed to improve our monitoring networks over time. To date, we have actually been successful in obtaining a substantial amount of state funding, over $900,000 to construct shallow and deep monitoring wells within the basin. We've already constructed 9 shallow wells near streams last year and are planning to construct 4 deep wells within the basin starting next year. So moving on to the next slide, another thing that the plan will need to address is whether groundwater pumping is causing any subsidence within the basin. This photo is taken in California's Central Valley, the southern San Joaquin Valley, and it shows how the land has sunk or subsided due to groundwater pumping and has actually damaged infrastructure, including the California aqueduct in this area. In our basin, analysis of the Santa Rosa Plain has found that while historically there has been some observed subsidence of less than 2 inches measured within the southern part of that basin during the time when those groundwater levels were declining that I showed earlier between 1992 to 2001. As those groundwater levels came back up, as groundwater pumping was reduced in that area, the land surface also rebounded, indicating that the subsidence that was occurring was elastic and not inelastic or irrecoverable subsidence, which we do not see any evidence of within our within our groundwater basin based on historical and more recent analysis. So the final thing we'll talk about in this presentation is groundwater quality. Groundwater quality within the subbasin is highly variable, but is generally acceptable for most beneficial uses. In some local areas of the basin, constituents of potential concern can pose challenges, including dissolved solids, nitrate, and arsenic. Arsenic occurs naturally due to geology and is carcinogenic at certain levels. Of 89 wells sampled for arsenic, about 17% of those exceeded the state defined maximum contaminant level, or MCL. Areas with elevated concentrations of arsenic are generally south of Santa Rosa, near the Sebastopol area, and near Marquess Creek by the Trenton Fault. And wells that have higher levels of arsenic are often required to treat arsenic at the wellhead to levels that are safe for use. Total dissolved solids refer to the amount of minerals, salts, metals, and other elements in the water. Of the wells tested for total dissolved solids, about 3 exceeded the MCLs. Nitrate is another constituent that's commonly associated with farming, septic systems, and wastewater discharge. Elevated levels of nitrate in drinking water are considered to be especially unhealthy for infants and pregnant women. Only 2 of the 92 groundwater samples analyzed for nitrate in the studies for the basin exceeded or equaled the nitrate MCL. There are also some contaminated sites within the basin, many of which are under active cleanup orders by the regional water quality control boards or county, which regulates those types of sites. These include leaking underground tanks, disposal sites, and military facilities. Generally, those releases from these sites are confined to relatively small areas, but in some cases, there have been impacts to nearby water supply wells. So moving on to interconnected surface water and groundwater dependent ecosystems. Section 3 of the plan will include information on creeks, streams, and other water bodies that are interconnected with groundwater, and included a discussion and mapping of plant and animal communities that are dependent on groundwater. And we're currently working with a work group of local experts to help us, biologists and fisheries experts, to help us identify where those occur in the basin and develop maps that are required by the GSPs. The final piece of Section 3 that is also still in production is the water budget. That's something you can kind of think of as a checkbook for groundwater. The water budget tells us how much groundwater is coming into the basin annually and how much groundwater is going out of the basin. A study conducted about 10 years ago for the whole larger watershed area found that on average there was a slight deficit with more water going out than coming in. We are currently in the process of updating this budget and the computer model for our basin, making it specific to our sub-basin. SGMA also requires that we project our basin's water budget out to the next 50 years into the future to evaluate how future climate and water demands may impact the basin. To help with that aspect, there are 2 additional working groups comprised of technical experts who are providing information to the GSAs on projected future land use and changes in agriculture that should be considered when we look at those projected water budgets. So that work will also inform that water budget, and we are planning to have the water budgets complete this fall. So in summary, the Santa Rosa Plain Basin can be characterized by many groundwater wells that are outside of urban areas that support residents, farming, and businesses. A high degree of geologic complexity, Mediterranean climate that's dependent on large storms, and droughts are also an important feature of our region that need to be considered, particularly when we look out into the future. Highly variable groundwater availability based on our complex geology. A characterization of both shallow and deep aquifer systems, currently and recently generally stable or increasing groundwater levels. No evidence of any permanent inelastic land subsidence in the basin, and relatively limited, but in some cases, some localized water quality issues within the basin. So with that, I think I'm turning it back over to Sam.
Great, thanks, Marcus. I did receive a few questions using the chat function. Really appreciate those. We'll read through those in just a moment. To start off our very brief, just clarifying Q&A period. Just as a quick reminder, we will have a breakout session in just a few minutes where you'll have the opportunity to discuss some of these issues in a little more depth together. What I would ask, if you'd like to ask a clarifying question right now and haven't had the opportunity to put it into the chat, is to use the little hand raise feature in your Zoom controls. That'll help us generate a conversation queue. And what I'll do when we get to that is mute and unmute your lines as your hands get raised. So to find that control, just go ahead and click on the participants button on your Zoom control, and then there should be a little blue hand raise feature in the lower left-hand corner of your screen. So go ahead, if you have a clarifying question, use that. But to start with, let me read through a couple of the questions we received in the chat. The first one is, does groundwater move across surface watershed boundaries, such as Sebastopol from the English Hill and Burnside area? Any thoughts on that, Marcus?
Yes, in some areas, as I mentioned in the presentation, the basin is connected with neighboring basins, and the Wilson Grove area is certainly one area where there is a strong connection between the Santa Rosa Plain and adjoining areas. That's part of the reason why we have included the entire contributing watershed of the subbasin within our analysis of our plan, and we feel that GSA would support additional monitoring and potentially projects that could benefit the basin in those areas. And so those connections between the basin is something that's very important. Sigma also requires that the groundwater sustainability plans do not allow for the actions in this basin to harm neighboring basins. So that's something that's going to need to be considered and factored into to the plan.
Great, thanks. And that really springboards into the next question about Wilson Grove. I know this is a subject that's come up a number of times in the advisory committee meetings and other venues associated with GSA development, but the participant notes that the wells in Wilson Grove should be monitored. It's very worrisome that they're not included in this process. Some hydrologists in that area are kind of frustrated and maybe a little bit concerned, that there aren't monitoring wells. How can we make sure that Wilson Grove is attended to?
Yeah, like I just mentioned, so there are portions of the Wilson Grove that are within that contributing watershed that we are incorporating data from available wells in those areas, and as well as wells that are just outside along the boundary. It's going to be really important for us to assess potential future changes to boundaries. And so I would say that future monitoring networks will be focused on better understanding the connections to areas that are connected with the basin, and that Wilson Grove area certainly is one of the more important connections in terms of neighboring basins.
Great, thank you. Another question is, what model is being used for the water budget?
So we have a model that's based on kind of one of the standard numerical groundwater flow models that's been developed by the U.S. Geological Survey, known as ModFlow. Our particular model is a kind of a more sophisticated version of that, which includes a surface water model as well that's fully coupled or connected or integrated with the groundwater model, allowing us to use the model to really kind of explore and better understand the connection between our groundwater and surface water resources. And that specific modeling code is known as GS flow. And so
Great.
that's a model that the USGS originally developed for us in 2014. There's a scientific paper that's been published on that. You can find a link to on our website. And we have recently been updating that model to more recent conditions and adding some enhancements to better simulate groundwater demands in the rural areas, including agricultural irrigation and rural residential groundwater use.
Great. And does that water budget account for climate change? Is there a discussion of climate change in that?
There will be. What we've been focusing on so far is developing what's known as the current and historical water budget. That goes back, I believe, in this basin to 1975 is when the hydrology and the model starts. And so we have that model running currently from that time frame to 2018. And we've recently provided a draft section of that current and historical water budget to the advisory committee. The materials and presentations that we provide to the advisory committee can all be accessed on the GSA's website under their meetings, and you can find those documents, those draft documents there if you're interested in those details. And so our next step is to develop this projected water budget that I described, which will need to project out 50 years into the future. And so we're currently evaluating, what future climate scenarios to utilize in that model. That's something we'll be discussing with our advisory committee in the Santa Rosa Plain in September.
Great. And just a couple other questions, and then we'll need to move on to the next presentation. One is just a request for information about where participants can see maps or more information about the contaminated wells that you mentioned.
Okay, yeah, that's another thing that is required by the plan. I believe we have a draft map in that basin setting section that we've been describing. If you follow the link on that first page to the draft GSP, I believe there's a figure in there that shows where those are at. As Andy Rogers is going to describe next, we are also required to analyze water quality and develop sustainable management criteria for water quality within the basin. And so that's something that we're taking a close look at with the advisory committee currently as well.
Wonderful. Thank you. And then the final question, if you look at the map that's displayed here, there was just a question about what the small grayed out area to the southwest of Santa Rosa is. I believe the participants referring to this area around Sebastopol, and I think that's just the urban footprint, if I understand correctly.
Well, there's the city of Sebastopol that's shown in that area, and then there's also parcels that are separate from Sebastopol and not part of the city of Santa Rosa proper. They're owned by the city of Santa Rosa. I think they're primarily associated with the Laguna wastewater treatment plant and farms that have storage ponds for water, as well as okay, I see a clarification. So those hatched areas are city of Santa Rosa property used for the recycled water program. The grayed out area that's just to the southwest of Katati is actually what some people might call a hole in the basin. So it's a hill within the basin that's made up of rock, volcanic rock primarily, which is not considered part of the groundwater basin itself by the Department of Water Resources. So the way that the California State Department of Water Resources maps out the basin is they look at areas where there are alluvial sediments or sedimentary formations, which is where groundwater is primarily found, and they exclude areas of bedrock and volcanic rock.
All right, thank you. Okay, at this point, we want to go ahead and transition over to the next presentation, just so that we give you all some time in your breakout sessions as well. Next up, we have Andy Rogers, who, as we mentioned at the beginning, is the administrator for the Santa Rosa Plain GSA, and he's going to walk you through an overview of what sustainability in the basin looks like. So let me go ahead and turn it over to Andy.
Thanks, Sam. Hope you can hear me. This is Andy Rogers. Thanks, Marcus, for the overview and the background and the setting. What I'm going to go through now is sustainable management criteria, and it's really hopefully going to seed some of the discussion in the breakout groups. So in the prior presentation, we learned that the Santa Rosa Plain Groundwater Sustainability Agency, the GSA, is complying with the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act by creating a groundwater sustainability plan that details the issues concerns with local groundwater. The plan will include a roadmap for how these concerns will be addressed to ensure there is enough water for people and the environment today and 50 years from now. In this presentation, we will discuss the heart of the plan called Sustainable Management Criteria. This presentation will cover the following topics: predicting future groundwater conditions, defining sustainability, understanding sustainability indicators, key terms related to sustainable management criteria, and next steps. One of the key components of the groundwater sustainability plan is to predict what challenges the basin will likely encounter in the future. To make these predictions as accurate as possible, the GSA will rely on a model which takes into account projected future water use, climate change, and other factors. The model will be updated periodically as new information becomes available. The kinds of questions that the modelers are exploring include: how much will the population change? Will the growth occur in the cities and or in the county, in the country? Will agriculture look the same? How will a changing climate affect rainfall, droughts, and water use? And we heard several of these questions from participants today already. All of these factors and many more could impact groundwater availability and quality. A workshop will be held this fall or winter to describe the modeling results for the Santa Rosa Plain Basin. The information developed by the model, which we were just discussing a bit, will be used in the groundwater sustainability plan to determine how the basin will reach and maintain long-term sustainability. Because no plan could be perfect and every basin has data gaps, the state anticipates that plans will continue to be refined and modified over time as new data is collected. In other words, the plans are working documents that will be adapted and modified as we continue to learn and collect data. Sustainability is a word that has many different meanings and can be broadly interpreted, as you all know. So the drafters of SGMA defined groundwater sustainability as the avoidance of locally defined significant and unreasonable conditions for 6 undesirable results. That's a mouthful, but here are the 6. Chronic lowering of groundwater levels, land subsidence caused by groundwater conditions such as pumping from wells, seawater intrusion due to groundwater conditions, which is not really an issue for this basin, but it is for others in California, as we're not geologically connected to the ocean or to the bay. Number 4, degradation of water quality caused by groundwater conditions, reduction of groundwater storage, and finally, depletion of interconnected surface water, like creeks and streams, caused by groundwater conditions. Throughout 2020, the focus of staff, the advisory committee, and the board are defining sustainable management criteria, or what sustainability means specifically and in measurable terms for the 6 undesirable results as defined by the state in the Santa Rosa Plain Basin. The drafters of SIGMA provided very specific terminology for how the GSA should define sustainability. For each of the 6 sustainability indicators, the sustainable management criteria include a sustainability goal, define significant and unreasonable effects, identify representative monitoring sites, develop measurable objectives, define minimum thresholds, determine undesirable results, develop interim milestones. A lot of actions and a lot of concepts. I think on the next slide, there's a link to basically a cheat sheet that has definitions for all these terms, because I know just hearing it for the first time, it's pretty hard to remember all these things. So at our website, you can find a way to reference these terms as we are going forward. We're going to right now spend a few minutes going into more detail on a few key terms. SIGMA requires that significant and unreasonable effects be described for each sustainability indicator. This is a qualitative statement that our gut tells us we don't want to happen. For example, for groundwater levels, significant and unreasonable effects could be in areas with stable groundwater. It would be significant and unreasonable if groundwater levels dropped below historical conditions. And in areas with declining trends, it would be significant and unreasonable if rural residents, farmers, municipal water users, businesses, the environment, and other beneficial uses are impacted by declining groundwater levels. Representative monitoring points reliably provide high-quality data that characterize representative groundwater conditions in the basin. The monitoring points are used to determine if the basin is meeting its sustainability objectives. The representative monitoring points are a subset of all the monitoring wells in the basin. The state requires that these wells meet certain requirements. Measurable objectives are specific, quantifiable goals at each representative monitoring site to maintain or improve groundwater conditions in order to achieve the aspirational sustainability goal for the basin. Measurable objectives reflect the GSA's desired groundwater conditions and guide the GSA to achieve its sustainability goal within 20 years. While measurable objectives define quantitatively where we would like to be, minimum thresholds are the numerical lines in the sand that we don't want to cross. For each sustainability indicator, the minimum thresholds are the quantitative measurable values that reflect what is significant and unreasonable at every measuring site. As an example, in the Santa Rosa Plain, the GSA is considering draft minimum thresholds that are intended to ensure that future groundwater levels do not dry up people's wells. Undesirable results are the worst case scenario and are a quantitative combination of the minimum thresholds that apply to individual wells, those regional monitoring points, that define sustainability for each sustainability indicator. Basically, undesirable results are the roll-up of the minimum thresholds, and they apply over the entire basin. The Groundwater Sustainability Plan will list which and how groundwater users will be affected if undesirable results occur, and if the GSP must also define a pathway for reaching sustainability. This image from the Norfolk Kings GSA pulls all these concepts together. Using the example of water quality, it shows on the bottom left the minimum threshold for water quality, noting that when the minimum threshold value is exceeded, it may cause significant and unreasonable degraded water quality that is considered an undesirable result. On the right side of the slide, we can see the much cleaner water that is achieved by meeting the measurable objective, which in our basin must be achieved by 2042. The Santa Rosa Plain Basin appears to be in okay shape based on the data that is currently available, and certainly compared to other basins in the state that are known to be critically overdrafted. The modeling that is underway will help us determine how the basin could look in 50 years. If modeling indicates there could be new problems or that existing problems will become worse and that undesirable results might occur, SGMA requires the Groundwater Sustainability Plan to identify potential projects and management actions. These projects and actions could be as simple as developing water conservation programs, or they could be as complex as developing projects that would recharge the basin with surface water, or expanding the use of recycled water to farmers more and others who currently use groundwater for irrigation. The GSA is committed to aggressively seeking grant funding to help pay for the costs of implementing the Groundwater Sustainability Plan. However, because groundwater users will ultimately benefit from a healthier basin, they will also pay some fees to help cover the costs, which will include putting in new monitoring wells, monitoring itself, and reporting and management of the GSA as required by the state of California and SGMA. The GSA won't start working on the implementation budget until 2021, but the work that's happening in 2020 is a key building block to future actions. It's important that groundwater users and people who care about the health of the aquifer share their thoughts now about what sustainability means to you. Currently, the GSA is finishing work on sustainable management criteria for water quality, land subsidence, and groundwater levels, and will soon tackle groundwater storage and interconnected surface water. Developing sustainable management criteria is an iterative process, and all the management criteria will be revisited, and if necessary, revised, after the GSA has determined which projects and management actions might be needed to achieve or maintain sustainability. The GSA plans to hold another community workshop later this year or in early 2021 to discuss modeling results and the draft sustainable management criteria. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Andy. So I know that was a lot of information for all of you to digest. We do want to make sure to give you time to discuss some of these issues and some of the materials that you just heard about in a series of breakout sessions. So what we're going to ask everybody to do right now is I will break you out into various rooms here and walk through a series of questions. Let me just display these up on your screen real quickly. All right. So all of you will be placed into a breakout session, and there'll be a facilitator to guide you through this process. What we're basically asking you to do is think about the questions that you see up on the screen here and answer them in order using the same process we did for the questions. So once the breakout sessions start, we'll just ask you to use the little hand raise function, which you can find by clicking on the participants button on your Zoom control, and the facilitator will mute and unmute you in order and answer both of these questions. You'll have about 25 minutes to walk through that, and then we'll rejoin as a group and just talk briefly about what you all learned in your individual sessions. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and start the sessions up here. I've tried my best to make sure that there's an equal number of participants in each one of the groups. But with that, we will rejoin in about 20 minutes or so. And just as I said, discuss what you learned. So with that, I hope you all have a great discussion. We'll go ahead and get started.